Abbiamo fatto una cosa che non voglio chiamare azzardo, ma certo una prova di coraggio. Credo che siamo l'unico evento in Italia, e forse non solo, ad anticipare i tempi invece di tardarli. Grazie. È veramente un momento un po' speciale per tutti noi, per l'anno e mezzo che abbiamo vissuto così in bilico, e speriamo davvero che questo festival, che saluta l'estate, che saluta la riapertura e il ritorno a una sorta di normalità, sia davvero il senso di un respiro. Questo era il tema dell'anno scorso, il senso di colmare e arrivare a riprovare ad avere tanti desideri che avevamo accantonato, sia anche la consapevolezza di quello che abbiamo affrontato e la voglia non di rimuoverlo, ma di tenerlo con noi. Questa esperienza globale è stata dura, ma non dobbiamo dimenticarla, dobbiamo continuare a ricordarci di quello che abbiamo attraversato e, come dire, farne patrimonio mentale e sentimentale. E ha un sentimento meraviglioso e dedicato il festival quest'anno, ma non tanto al sentimento. Abbiamo consapevolmente portato l'attenzione sul soggetto, cioè noi, i desideranti, e non sull'oggetto o sul sentimento in sé. È forse il festival più umano degli ultimi anni, perché umano in senso di genere umano ben inteso, perché credo che ci riguardi tutti in un modo così pieno e così ricco, a cui risponderanno tutti gli incontri di quest'anno. È bello per me ringraziare le istituzioni che ci accompagnano in questo percorso. Parlo della Regione Piemonte e della città di Torino, e naturalmente delle fondazioni bancarie, la Compagnia di San Paolo e la Fondazione CRT. Ovviamente ringraziamo di cuore anche i nostri partner, a incominciare dal Teatro Stabile, da questa collaborazione davvero di lungo corso che speriamo di continuare fino a data da destinarsi. La Vazza Group, che è il nostro main partner, Audible partner, e Acqua Sparea, che è partner tecnico. Quindi auguro a tutti di tutto cuore buon festival, e vi ricordo che non finisce qui, perché alcuni incontri imperdibili si potranno seguire on demand alla fine del festival. Quindi è un percorso di desiderio e desideranti che auguro a tutti di cuore. E adesso la parola al protagonista indiscusso di questo festival, che è Armando Buonaiuto. Grazie.
Buonasera, grazie a tutti, grazie mille. Desidero ringraziare voi per essere qui. Desidero ringraziare le persone che ci seguono online, perché molte persone sono collegate, e da subito anche vorrei ringraziare, voi non la vedete, Simona Caldera è all'interno della cabina della traduzione, ma senza di lei questa sera tutto sarebbe molto più complesso. E poi naturalmente ringrazio l'editore Einaudi, perché noi serbavamo questo desiderio di aprire così, con un tale ospite, questa nostra 17ª edizione, e Einaudi ci ha aiutati a far sì che questo potesse accadere. E poi ovviamente il mio ringraziamento più grande, davvero un ringraziamento di cuore, è al nostro ospite di stasera, Kazuo Ishiguro. Grazie mille per essere con noi. Dico a voi pubblico, io guardo di là e non guardo verso di voi perché Ishiguro mi vede da quella camera, quindi insomma, giusto che lo sappiate. Contestualizzo un po' per voi che siete qui e per chi ci ascolta da casa il tema del desiderio rispetto ai romanzi di Ishiguro. Vabbè, intanto vi ho detto, questo è un grande desiderio esaudito e questo è già una cosa che ci lega a questo festival. Ma noi, come ha anticipato Elena, parlando di desideranti intendiamo parlare di noi esseri umani che siamo costantemente protesi su un oltre e siamo anche costantemente segnati da una mancanza, perché il desiderio è anche mancanza. moltissimi dei personaggi dei romanzi di Ishiguro sono dei desideranti, ma spesso nei suoi romanzi sono persone che si accorgono troppo tardi di quali fossero i loro veri desideri e sperimentano quindi tanto lo slancio quanto la mancanza di ciò a cui aspirano, e lo sperimentano spesso nel medesimo momento. Diverso il caso di Klara e il sole, che è l'ultimo romanzo che Ishiguro ha scritto, il primo dopo il conferimento del Nobel. Tra l'altro lo leggete in una meravigliosa traduzione di Susanna Basso. Ecco, questo personaggio qui è un po' diverso, perché quando noi conosciamo Klara, che è la protagonista del romanzo, da subito Ishiguro ce la racconta come una desiderante. Klara è un androide ed è in un negozio quando noi la incontriamo, in attesa di essere venduta. E lei è un androide che funziona a energia solare, e da subito Ishiguro ce la mostra mentre lei si protende un po' verso la vetrina a cercare di cogliere i raggi del sole. Quindi da subito è slanciata in avanti, è immediatamente desiderante rispetto a qualcosa che le manca. E poi subito dopo Klara comincia a nutrire anche un altro tipo di desiderio, perché lei è un androide da compagnia, un artificial friend. E lei attende che un adolescente venga ad acquistarla, perché è a questo che servono gli androidi in questo romanzo, servono a evitare che gli adolescenti si sentano soli. E lei incontrerà una bambina, una ragazzina a 14 anni, Josie, si vedranno attraverso la vetrina, si scambieranno alcuni cenni, alcune parole, e da lì Klara inizierà subito a nutrire il desiderio della presenza di Josie, di essere acquistata da Josie. Questa cosa poi accadrà. Klara però, l'androide, dovrà pazientare un po' prima che il suo desiderio sia esaudito, e vivrà anche l'arte dell'attesa, che è un'altra cosa legata al desiderio, e la vivrà benissimo, di slancio, assai desiderante e molto speranzosa, certa che prima o poi comunque il suo desiderio verrà esaudito. E così sarà, perché a un certo punto Josie arriverà nel negozio, acquisterà Klara, e Klara andrà a vivere con lei e con la madre di Josie, e inizierà la sua missione, che appunto è contrastare la solitudine degli adolescenti, la solitudine degli esseri umani. E non è una missione facile, e Klara ce lo dirà molto molto presto. Ci dirà: io da subito cominciai a rendermi conto che gli esseri umani, pur di non sentirsi soli, sono disposti a manovre complessissime e anche difficili da decifrare. Ed è vero, siamo così, a tanto ci porta il desiderio di non essere soli, a compiere mille manovre. Klara dovrà trovare il modo. E allora il tema della solitudine ci è sembrato una bellissima chiave per entrare non solo in questo romanzo, ma in tanti altri romanzi di Ishiguro. Dunque io, la primissima domanda che vorrei porre a Kazuo Ishiguro, che io chiamerò Ish, ma non per prendermi delle confidenze con un premio Nobel, ma perché è lui stesso che mi ha proposto di fare così, e mi sembra un bel modo anche per rendere più informale questa conversazione. Io vorrei chiedere da subito a Ish sul tema della solitudine. Noi siamo soliti pensare alla solitudine, forse a leggerla più in termini spaziali, cioè io dico mi sento solo perché non ho nessuno accanto. I tuoi personaggi però, non solo di Klara e il Sole, ma di tanti altri romanzi, vivono delle solitudini temporali, nel senso che loro sembrano, quando tu ce li mostri, isolati in una specie di temporalità che li sottrae al flusso del mondo e li fa soli. Penso a un romanzo come Non lasciarmi, alla protagonista Katie, che è un clone. Quando tu ce la presenti, lei ha un futuro molto breve davanti a sé, non ha più di fatto un passato, perché il luogo in cui è nata e cresciuta non c'è più, e non ci sono neanche più i suoi amici cloni. Allo stesso modo il maggiordomo Stevens, in Quel che resta del giorno, anche lui è attaccato a un passato che vorrebbe rianimare, ma che non è trasportabile nel suo presente, e anche il suo è un presente di solitudine. E invece poi c'è Klara. Klara, noi la incontriamo, appunto, come ho detto, è già slanciata in avanti, è già desiderante, non ha un passato perché è un androide, l'hanno appena costruita. E quindi è molto più capace anche di lanciarsi con leggerezza nelle relazioni. Allora volevo domandarti se in qualche modo i tuoi romanzi vogliono alludere al fatto che rispetto alla potenzialità delle relazioni alle volte il passato è una zavorra, è una specie di ragnatela che ci imprigiona.
Ok,
Okay, let me say two things here about what you just said. I mean, it's quite a complicated question to start the whole session. But thinking about what you just said, I think probably the kind of loneliness that Klara starts to observe in the human world when she goes out into it is probably deeper than the kind of loneliness we might experience just simply being alone in a space, or because our friends aren't calling us on the phone or anything like that. And I think this is a suggestion that might exist in all of those books that you just mentioned of mine, that there is something fundamentally lonely about human beings. It's part of the human condition to be lonely in quite a deep and profound way. And this is what Klara starts to, I think, suspect. Because at the beginning, she thinks she just needs to be a companion to somebody. But she starts to understand there is something about human nature that makes human beings lonely. And it's something to do with the fact that human beings, we, Armando, you and me, and we are very complicated creatures. We have the ability to build very complex worlds, inner worlds around us. And this is what makes human beings very special and very individual. And this is what makes one individual human being very different from the next one. And this is why it makes sense to say that you love this particular person and you don't love this person. We can make each of ourselves very separate and different because we have the ability to create these very complicated castles, if you like, around each of us. And this has been the great thing about human beings. But at the same time, I think it means that we become very isolated from each other. And I think my feeling is that we all know this at some fundamental level. We all know that we are actually alone, but we try very hard to build things like families, communities, countries. We build very ingenious things like art, books, restaurants, so that we can forget how actually alone we are. But every now and again, a reminder comes of the actual truth that we are, each of us individually, very, very separate. And I give you an example of this is the penalty shootout in football matches. You see this, the ultimate representation of this. For a long time, you're watching a football match where you forget individuals. It's team versus team. And there are millions of people watching. So it seems you can forget this whole idea of human beings being lonely individuals. We just seem to be this very, very communal thing, But then suddenly you get to a penalty shootout every now and again. And suddenly you watch a single player walking up to take a penalty kick. And that player, nothing can break his loneliness. He knows that if he misses, he'll remember it for the rest of his life. All his friends and his family will remember it for the rest of his life. Millions of people watching, his teammates, try and make him less alone, but there's nothing you can do about it. And I think it's become one of these profound things that we feel when we watch a football match. We recognize that as a kind of a metaphor. And of course, when we watch people in pain, when we watch people close to death, and indeed when we watch people giving birth, I think we get that same sense of helplessness, that you can't break that loneliness. And I think these are moments when we're reminded, however hard we try to create these wonderful communities through love and friendship, that there is something about human nature that keeps us very, very separate. And so I think in Klara and the Sun that this novel and many of my other novels, I think exploits and looks at this situation. So I think it's that kind of loneliness that I'm interested in as an author. And I think that's the kind of loneliness that Klara learns about when she comes out into the human world and starts to study human beings.
Io immagino che da scrittore tu sia anche abituato alla solitudine. C'è, tra l'altro, nel discorso per il conferimento del Nobel racconti un momento di gioventù in cui eri nel Norfolk, in una stanza solitaria a scrivere, e c'è anche questo dettaglio che tu ricordi di un'unica finestrella dalla quale potevi guardare fuori se ti mettevi in punta di piedi, che tra l'altro è una cosa bellissima perché si ricollega a un momento in Klara e il Sole in cui Klara è da sola dentro a una sorta di soffitta e c'è un'unica finestrella in alto e anche lei deve arrampicarsi per poter guardare fuori. Quindi sicuramente tu hai dovuto acquisire dimestichezza con la solitudine, un po' come Klara. Perché Klara, tra l'altro, appunto, abbiamo detto che per tanti personaggi tuoi è una zavorra la solitudine. Klara invece sembra saperci anche convivere. Volevo chiederti del tuo rapporto con la solitudine e se in qualche modo in effetti ha una sua preziosità.
There's more kind of superficial loneliness, as distinct from the kind of fundamental loneliness I just tried to describe. I don't have any difficulty with at all. But that is partly because I've always lived with my wife, and until fairly recently, I was living with my daughter, who is also a novelist, Naomi Ishiguro. Now she lives with her boyfriend, but I've never been lonely at that level, if you like. I've always lived in families. I've always lived with friends. I tend to be quite a sociable person, but I think in the way that I described before, I think each human being, I mean, in order to pay some sort of respect to our individual complexity, we do also need to find this kind of space. And I don't have trouble with loneliness at that level. But I mean, maybe sometime in the future I will. I mean, there are many people who suffer from loneliness at every level. But my novels don't tend to be really concerned, as I say, with that kind of day-by-day loneliness. That window, by the way, that Klara ends up rather like, I mean, the window you describe in Klara and the Sun, I think it's not really me remembering the window when I was a student, when I started my career as a writer. I think of windows that I've seen in old people's homes. And my own mother, when she was towards the end of her life, that when you're old and you can't move around very much, the window in your room becomes very, very important. And I think it's that kind of window I had in mind at the end of that novel.
Anche questa finestra è uno spazio dove passa il desiderio, no? Perché, specie poi forse in ciò che hai descritto tu, la solitudine di una persona anziana, e questa finestra è una feritoia attraverso la quale puoi proiettare forse ciò che ancora vorresti, ciò che ti manca, ciò che ancora vorresti raggiungere. Allora io vorrei chiederti invece del desiderio, che è l'altro polo di questa nostra conversazione. Noi l'abbiamo intitolato questo appuntamento Il desiderio di non essere soli, quindi ci muoveremo tra solitudine e desiderio, provando anche a sfiorare altri temi. Rispetto il desiderio è un mondo vastissimo, è anche difficile porre una domanda precisa rispetto al desiderio, però immagino che leggendo i tuoi romanzi lo si capisce, tu faccia il possibile per trascinare anche il desiderio sulla pagina. Mi interessava quindi il rapporto tra desiderio e scrittura, in te come scrittore e poi nella possibilità concreta di calare qualcosa di così impalpabile come il desiderio nella forma della pagina, calarlo dentro un personaggio e far capire quale tipo di aspirazione lo agiti e lo muova.
Okay, so let's talk about desire in stories. I mean, I should make clear here, I'm talking about this idea of desire as it is used in storytelling, because it's such a big subject. And I'm sure other guests that you have at this festival will cover many of the different aspects of desire. But I'm just making this subject a little bit smaller right now. I want to talk about how the importance of desire when you are trying to construct a story. Now, I would say that thinking about the character's desire lines, there's this kind of term called desire lines, right? It's one of the fundamental tools in actually creating a story. Often when people study literature at universities or schools, I think there's still the traditional tendency to talk in terms of plot and character. I've long since abandoned that. I find it much more interesting to think of a story in terms of relationships and the desires of the characters. Let me just say about this the desire lines. I mean, this is an oversimplification. In stories, when we create a novel or we create a movie, we often create simplifications. I think in life, desire is messy and blurred, and it's very hard to see a clear line. But in stories, and when people like me make up stories, we like to simplify. And I think it's all right to simplify. I think it's an important simplification because it allows us to see life more clearly when we simplify things. So typically in a novel, let us say, or perhaps a movie, I am always very conscious of what the desires of a particular character are. You can call it a desire line, if you like, the kind of the target, what that person is aiming for in the story. Now, let me just say a very important thing about this. I find it very interesting. A story becomes rich and interesting when a character not only has more than one desire line, but when we discover, as the reader or as the person watching a movie, when we discover that one desire actually lives inside a larger desire. And perhaps this larger desire in itself lives inside an even larger one. In other words, it's like a Russian doll structure. So let me give you an example. I mean, I'm in Italy, so I'll pick an Italian movie like Bicycle Thieves. And the story of Bicycle Thieves is very simple. It moves around the idea that the main character wants to find his stolen bicycle. And that defines the story. And that is his main desire. So it's very simple. Desire, retrieve stolen bicycle. But of course, it wouldn't be very interesting if that desire that you see at the front isn't actually encased in a larger desire, which is the desire to be able to feed his family and to be able to win the respect of his small son. Yeah, and perhaps that is inside an even larger desire to see a more just and equal world, and that he can be part of it. And so I think this is when desire when you structure desire in a story, I think you build a lot of richness by putting the desire you see at the front of the story and then making sure that the audience or the readers can understand the larger desire that it lives inside. So often you have a story like this. Somebody wants to climb up a mountain and he's determined to climb the mountain, and the story is about how he climbs the mountain. But that's not interesting unless you realize that he thinks by climbing the mountain, he will gain the love of a woman that he's been longing for. And if he does that, he'll gain a certain position in society and so on. Okay, so this is very important, this Russian doll structure of desire in stories. Without that, I think desire by itself in characters isn't so interesting. And then there are other things I would now say, and this applies to my own work often. It becomes very interesting, of course, when the desire that you see at the beginning, the character doesn't understand that hasn't actually acknowledged the larger desire behind it. They're determined to do something, and they're not conscious that why they want to achieve this, but they're not aware of this larger structure. Or there's another variation. Somebody is determined to try and do something, but we, the audience or the readers, can see that it will not lead to the larger desire. So typically, in many Hollywood movies of the 1930s, romantic movies, the heroine is determined to marry somebody who we can all see is the wrong person. But she thinks, by her desire is to marry this person, and her larger desire is to win happiness and a position in society. And we can see that this is a mistake. Right? So there's a tension, this smaller desire doesn't really belong in the larger desire. So there's a tension there. And in relation to my own books, like Klara and the Sun to some extent, but my previous novels recently, like Never Let Me Go, Non Lasciarmi, I think it's called in Italian. I'm interested in desires that are impossible. You have this desire and you want to do this particular task because you think it will achieve this larger desire. But actually, it's impossible. And there is something very sad and tragic about this. The belief that perhaps love can defeat death, something like this, and that if you complete this mission, somehow love will defeat death. And we know that's impossible. But you can see these people trying very hard. They really want to achieve something. And so I think so for me, desire is one of the really essential tools in putting a story together. But I have to emphasize that it's like a tool. In real life, I think desire is much messier and harder to define. It's harder to see a clear line. In stories, we like to simplify. But I think we always need this structure, the Russian doll structure of desire. Otherwise, the stories don't mean anything very big. They're just stories about people who want to get their bicycle back, and nothing else.
Rispetto a questa cosa della struttura a matriosca come l'hai tracciata, in effetti come cerchi concentrici di progressiva espansione, i tuoi romanzi a volte lavorano però anche in direzione opposta, cioè sembra di andare a fare delle immersioni invece sempre più profondamente nei personaggi. Hai parlato anche del cinema. A me una cosa che ha sempre sorpreso vedendo i film tratti dai tuoi romanzi è che siano dei bei film, nel senso che i tuoi romanzi, leggendoli, sembrano difficili da tradurre cinematograficamente, perché in grande parte si svolgono dentro al protagonista. Mi interessava molto questo aspetto del cinema, poiché anche tu, insomma, hai anche scritto tu in prima persona per il cinema. Mi chiedevo se tu hai collaborato agli script tratti dai tuoi film. Non lasciarmi l'ha scritto Alex Garland, questo lo so, penso l'abbia scritto, immagino da solo, su James Ivory per Quel che resta del giorno. Non so se tu abbia in qualche modo collaborato, oppure se invece da scrittore in quel momento ti ritrai come a dire: io ho creato la storia, ma ci sono più modi per narrarla, tu regista fanne più o meno nei limiti ciò che vuoi.
If people want my help, I'm very happy to discuss it. But for my own books, if somebody is trying to make a film or perhaps a play or a radio program, I've had all these things happen. I think it's healthier if I keep a back seat, because I think the people who create the new work have to feel that they own it. It has to be something that they personally feel they're expressing their own vision in. Now, of course, this presents a bit of a problem sometimes, and I can see the difficulty for many authors in when they get into this position. And I think there are two typical attitudes I've noticed. I mean, some authors regard the movie adaptation like a translation. Like the Italian translation, the French translation of a book that they have written in English or German or something. And of course, they think they have the right to expect a very faithful translation. Now, actually, I think that's a mistake. Partly because I think it's impossible to achieve, but also because it doesn't respect the new art form. So I always say to people when they're adapting my work, and always there's somebody adapting my work. I mean, they don't always end up as a final film, but there's many people are trying always to attempt to adapt my work. I always say to them, look, just forget me. Just go somewhere that you really believe in with that book, and turn it into a film. Now, this might seem like I'm being very modest, but actually, the truth is that I'm actually being very, very egotistical, because my ambition as a writer of stories is to be somebody like Homer, or the person who created fairy tales. I think it's a wonderful thing if I write a story and it exists inside a book, but other people actually take the same story and adapt it, and it keeps being adapted and changing, and it becomes part of society. I think this is a grand ambition for a writer to have, rather than saying, you just wanted this story to just live only in its first form. I think it's wonderful to be part of this huge tradition, this kind of river of story making that runs through human history. And that to think that even in a small way, you can contribute to this larger tide of people who tell stories, adapt them, and preserve them, and they make the stories evolve and change through the generations. I think that's a wonderful thing. And at the moment, I think we live in quite an exciting time, because we can move from a novel to a movie to a television series that just expands that world in a very short period of time. It can become a graphic novel. So I think that process that in the oral tradition used to take a long time has now been accelerated. So I take that view that I'm being somebody like Boccaccio or Homer or something, So I'm quite happy. They can take it, if they take it away and change it, that's fine with me.
Però mi chiedevo, avendo tu insomma lavorato su entrambi i versanti, tanto la scrittura quanto il cinema, c'è secondo te però diciamo un margine di non traducibilità quando passi dal romanzo al cinema? Qual è? Ci sarà un elemento forse che è più complesso, che per il romanzo è praticabile e invece per il cinema è molto più complesso? Tu l'hai trovato un elemento simile, perché leggendo i tuoi romanzi ci sono alcuni passaggi, ma anche alcune strutture così mobili, così strutturate non tanto con per linearità di narrazione, ma attraverso rimandi, analogie, rispecchiamenti, che è difficile pensare che il cinema riesca a stargli dietro.
Yes, it's because right at the beginning of my career, I wrote my first novel, and then I wrote 2 scripts for television here in Britain, which went out as television films. And by the time I wrote my second novel, I very much wanted my novel to be very different from the scripts. I thought that it was a kind of a failure if a novel worked in much the same way as the scripts do. And so I wanted in a way to write a novel that was impossible to translate into film. And so I think I developed this style. I mean, partly I stole it from Marcel Proust, because just when I was trying to figure out this question, how do I make a novel, something that can only work on the page, I got ill and I was in bed for about 3 days. And there was this kind of strange object in the bed that, and I had a high temperature, and my leg kept kicking this very hard object in my bed. And when I got slightly better, I grabbed this thing that had been annoying me for days, and it was a huge volume of Proust. And so I read it, and it had a profound influence on me, partly because I was still quite fevered, and ill. And a lot of the things that you mentioned there, telling a story through memory and thought association, I developed that style just as a result of reading this very annoying book that for some reason was in my bed, inside my bedclothes. And I think that is something that novels can do very, very well. One of the things that cinema cannot do very well, I think, is memory. And it's very difficult to think of a single film that has actually dealt successfully, I think, with memory. Whereas I think the novel on the page is beautifully adapted to recreate the passages of memory and the way memory works in our heads. And I think I have a theory about this. In fact, I know that, Armando, you have a background in film theory and film criticism, so perhaps you have some ideas about this too. But one of the reasons I think memory never works very well in film, is because, well, first of all, let me just say, of course, there are many films that use flashback very effectively. But it's just a device. It's just a way of changing the order in which the story is told. Most flashback moments in cinema never feel like memory as we experience it. There is no texture of memory. There is a signal to say we are going back in time, and then the story is told in exactly the same clear, concrete, crisp way. But I think my theory about this, and perhaps you'll disagree with me, Armando, but I think it's because when you and I remember something, let's say, if I asked you to remember your birthday when you were 10 or something like this, we don't remember in moving images. I think we tend to remember in stills. It's like a tableau vivant. We remember one image, and it's very hazy at the corners and at the edges. And then we start a process of interrogating this kind of still image. And we can see maybe, some people sitting at a table, and we are wondering, what is at the edge there? Was there a dog? Or perhaps it wasn't a dog, perhaps it was a bicycle at the edge. Was it just before we came in from church? Or was it after we went to the cinema? So you start to look at a still picture and you start to ask questions. And I think that is a typical way in which we remember and how memory works. And there is something about cinema, because it's moving images, it cannot recreate that process. And I think this is why still today, people love still photographs to remember precious memories. There is something much closer to the real memory process about stills. And I think this is why I think when I write a novel and I try to tell stories through memory, I try and copy this idea. My narrator often actually brings up a kind of a still, almost like a still scene first, and then they start to actually ask questions about it, and they start to tell the reader what might have been happening just before this scene, what might have happened just after it. It's a bit hazy as to who was there. Was that person there or no? Maybe that was another time. Very difficult to do this in cinema because it's too realistic and it moves. But I don't know. You've thought a lot about cinema. I know, Armando. I don't know if you agree with that, or you think, or perhaps you can think of many films that have successfully recreated memory. I can't think of any.
Ma è molto interessante. Adesso stavo provando a pensare quando io ricordo le mie memorie se sono fotogrammi o in movimento. Forse io tendo più a ricordare, forse in movimento, però effettivamente sono sfocatissime. Cioè io non so se sia perché io ho cattiva memoria, però credo che una delle qualità della nostra memoria sia di avere una grana anche un po' sfocata, che forse la rende già per questo inadatte al cinema, che il cinema è visione e visibile, quindi già una grana sfocata poco si presta. E poi forse pensavo, rispetto a ciò che dici, che nel mio caso le memorie sono anche più affidate ad altri sensi, sono poco legate al visivo, ma tu citavi Proust, chiaramente insomma viene in mente la Madeleine, quindi olfatto, gusto. Forse le mie memorie effettivamente sono più legate a un'altra sfera di sensazioni, che ancora però, come dici tu, le rende inadatte a essere trasposte in cinema. Se penso a dei film che forse, non so, Il posto delle fragole di Bergman è un bel film sulla memoria, e riesce anche a evitare quel fatto di dover mostrare il personaggio che fa così prima di entrare in un flashback, perché si focalizza sulle fragole e poi va sul... E poi forse in italiano è Se mi lasci ti cancello, in italiano è The Endless of the Spotless Mind. Anche lì c'è una bella trattazione. Uno che secondo me è un capolavoro rispetto alla capacità di mostrare la memoria, è un film di Terence Davis, che tra l'altro è appunto autore britannico, quindi sicuramente in italiano è Voci lontane sempre presenti, e praticamente ci sono dei quadri affollatissimi di persone quasi ieratici, e procede un po' per associazioni di immagini. È pazzesco, quasi non è un film, quasi è una poesia, è un film in poesia invece che in prosa. E non so se è un film che anche tu in qualche modo hai amato, se ce ne sono, perché a questo punto mi incuriosisce sapere da te se ci sono dei film che noi poi dopo possiamo andare tutti a vederci, che raccontano la memoria nella maniera in cui tu credi che sia possibile.
Well, Armando, I deliberately didn't mention that Terence Davis movie, Distant Voices, Still Lives, because I think that is one of the very, very few movies that perhaps disprove my theory. So I deliberately didn't mention it, but you are right. But in a way, it supports my theory because it works. I mean, I don't know how many people in the audience have watched this movie, but it works in stills. I mean, although it's a movie, every scene starts like a tableau vivant. You know, the camera just stays on some kind of thing like a room or just a gathering, and then very gradually the figures start to move, and the structure, he actually replicates this very structure that I just described. Tarkovsky's Mirror, I think, tries to do it, but I think it's a wonderful film, but I don't think it's really about memory. Or at least it doesn't recreate memory. And an Italian film that I think is quite good on memory, actually, is the Western, Once Upon a Time in the West, Sergio Leone's Western. Only in a small way, but once again, because it's based around the tableau vivant, the Charles Bronson character keeps having these strange, dreamlike flashbacks that are very mysterious throughout the film, until the very end, when you understand why he needs to get his revenge. But very interestingly, what Leone shows us at the very end to explain the whole feud between Charles Bronson and Henry Fonda is a tableau vivant. I mean, of course, people move slightly, but there's this horrific picture that you can see in just one go. And it is exactly the way that somebody would remember from their childhood. You know, it's not a series of events that unfold. It is just this one image that tells you what this terrible thing that happened to him. And it's presented with music, grand music, as though it's just a living picture. And I think memory works very well like that. But perhaps we shouldn't talk too much about film theory. There was one other thing I wanted to say about desire, because we were talking about desire earlier. And when you were talking earlier on about characters being caught in a temporal space in there with desire. There is one other thing I want to say about desire. I think it's quite interesting when characters in books, and I think people in real life, project a desire backwards through time that they didn't actually have. I think people do this a lot. I mean, in other words, people say, I remember it was always my ambition to end up in this house with this job. 10 years ago, that was my big wish, and I'm very pleased because I'm here. But actually, if you got in a time machine and went back 10 years, that's not what they wished at all. But I think this is a very interesting characteristic of human beings, that we try to dignify the place where the wind has dropped us in life. We try to dignify it by pretending that we always wanted to come here, and we have achieved something through our own endeavor to come here. And so we often project backwards through time desires that we didn't have, to give ourselves dignity and to give our lives meaning. And I find that a very interesting aspect of human desire. And I think I've explored that a number of times in my books, in particular a book I wrote in 1995 called The Unconsoled. But I think that element is often in my work.
Questo elemento mi fa pensare, mi riporta a un altro tema ancora che incrocia desiderio e solitudini, che è il tema dell'amore, l'amore di coppia, perché penso che quello che hai detto qualcuno l'avrà sperimentato, no? Che quando motivi la tua situazione di coppia alla luce di un passato che ti sembra più brillante. Non sto parlando della mia relazione, chiaramente, perché mia moglie è qua presente, ma credo che sia qualcosa che qualcuno può condividere. Ma volevo chiederti in realtà, perché un altro tema che tu affronti in una maniera particolare è quello dell'amore, e appunto specialmente dell'amore di coppia. C'è una ricorrenza in alcuni tuoi romanzi del fatto che le coppie innamorate sono sempre sottoposte a un giudizio esterno a un certo punto. In Non lasciarmi, i cloni pensano insomma di sapere che le coppie innamorate avranno la possibilità di avere un rinvio rispetto al fatto di finire su un tavolo operatorio per donare i loro organi, perché questa è la loro funzione, e quindi devono dimostrare il loro amore credono di dover dimostrare il loro amore ai loro superiori. Nel Gigante sepolto ci sono queste due figure, una coppia anziana molto bella, Axel e Beatrice, molto solleciti l'uno nei confronti dell'altra, e alla fine dovranno sottoporsi anche loro a esame, dovranno dimostrare a un barcaiolo che loro effettivamente sono una coppia che si ama, e allora potranno transitare insieme. E anche in Klara e il Sole in realtà un po' questo accade, perché a un certo punto Klara interloquisce col Sole, e con il Sole si fa garante dell'amore di Josie, la ragazzina appunto con cui lei vive, e di un ragazzino, Rick, con cui appunto Josie condivide una relazione. Ancora una volta c'è bisogno di un garante, c'è bisogno di un esame. Come mai sottoponi questi amori di coppia agli esami, e se tua moglie ti guarda storto quando arriva a questi passaggi dei tuoi romanzi?
That's a very good question. I don't think they're real tests. I think it goes back to what I was talking about earlier when we were talking about desire. These are impossible wishes. And it's an expression, I think, of an impossible wish. And I think perhaps somewhere the characters know that it's impossible. We, the readers, always know that this is impossible. That it revolves around this idea that there is something so special about love, about true love. It's something so wonderful. It's difficult to find, and it's difficult to hold on to, and it's difficult to build. But if you think you've done it, it is so special that it must deserve something unusual. Even perhaps you can be spared death, or at least you can delay death. And this idea that true love can actually be more powerful than death is a very, very ancient one. that we encounter this in stories of every culture. But I think it's because in some very irrational, crazy way, we like to believe it. We know that it's not true, but we want to believe that it is. And I find this is a very beautiful aspect of human beings. And it's a very beautiful aspect of people's love for each other. But we were talking earlier about desire, and I was saying that when you construct stories around people's desires, the stories become very rich when there is some tension between the smaller desire and the desire that it lives inside. And I think it becomes very poignant and heartbreaking sometimes when we know that these wishes are impossible, when the desire is an impossible desire, but it's a desire that all of us wish was possible. The title of that novel in English, Never Let Me Go, I think it's slightly different. I mean, it's absolutely wonderful translation in Italian, but I think the title is translated as Non lasciarmi, I think, which I don't know if it has quite the same idea, but Never Let Me Go is an impossible request. And that's why the title always appealed to me. It's a title of a song, a famous song, but I mean, as soon as I heard that title, I thought I wanted to use it as an idea and a title of my novel, because it's an impossible request. Somebody who makes that request knows, even as they make the request, that it can't possibly be granted. At some point, the other person will have to let go. Or even if they don't, something will come along and separate the two people. So you know that it's a hopeless request, but it's not a meaningless request, because it expresses the depth of that desire. And I find this very powerful when a desire is impossible, but it is nevertheless, it is expressed.
Mi chiedevo se ti capita di sentire un senso di responsabilità nei confronti dei desideri dei tuoi personaggi, e te lo domando perché in Klara il Sole ci sono un paio di momenti in cui sembra che tu stia, come dire, dando una seconda chance a personaggi di altri tuoi romanzi precedenti. C'è un momento splendido in Klara il Sole in cui un uomo e una donna anziani si riconoscono da un lato all'altro della strada. Fino a un attimo prima pioveva, appena smesso di piovere, loro si abbracciano e sembrano, a me hanno fatto pensare immediatamente a un finale alternativo, a una coccola che tu regali a figure come il maggiordomo Steven e Miss Kenton, che si salutano, invece si dicono addio sotto la pioggia e forse non si vedranno più, anche loro sono avanti nell'età. E invece queste due figure che si reincontrano, delle quali poi tu non dici, non entri in dettaglio, non dici altro, quindi sono come una visione, e mi hanno fatto pensare un po' a loro, così come la bambina Josie che è malata e questo ragazzino Rick e questa loro relazione, insomma, che sarà libera forse di procedere nel futuro, mi ha fatto pensare che tu anche qui stessi regalando in qualche modo una seconda chance invece a quella coppia meravigliosa ma tristissima, rappresentata, che in Non lasciarmi è rappresentata da Katie e Tommy, che sono destinati purtroppo a non avere un futuro insieme. Quindi mi sembrava che tu facessi così nella realtà del tuo romanzo quello che fa McEwan in Espiazione, no? La protagonista del romanzo di McEwan, Bryony, che crea delle realtà alternative per una coppia infelice. Quindi così, volevo sapere se c'è un senso di responsabilità verso i desideri dei tuoi personaggi. Se ti capita, dici, beh, ho la pagina davanti, adesso gli creo un finale che magari in qualche modo li ricompensa di un dolore passato.
No, I'm not so generous. I think Armando, you are much more generous than I am, and and it's kind of you. I will thank you on behalf of my sad characters that you can see these possibilities, that there are alternative endings I've implanted into later books for them. No, I'm a more brutal character. It never occurred to me that these little happy glimpses you have in some books are the resolutions of kind of unhappy endings from previous books. No, I think, but I will say this though. I will say this. I think Klara and the Sun, my latest book, is a kind of reply to my earlier book, Never Let Me Go. They're very different books in many ways, but a few years ago, I had to reread Never Let Me Go. I can't remember for what reason, but I had to reread it for some task. And I thought this book was extremely sad. And I thought the man who wrote this book just needs to cheer up. And I think for that reason, when perhaps because I've got older and I've perhaps become more cheerful. So when I wrote Klara and the Sun, I was actually I had it in my mind that in some way I wanted to correct the sadness of Never Let Me Go. I didn't want Klara and the Sun to be sentimental, but I thought the world is full of possibilities of good endings as well as sad endings. And in fact, I've begun to think recently that there's a tendency to be sentimental about misery and sadness, just as there is a tendency to be sentimental about happy endings. Now, I think it's possible to just for the sake of melodrama and wanting to manipulate people's emotions, to just create some kind of huge festival of misery, just for the impact. And I think in many ways that is just as sloppy and untrue as syrupy, sentimental stories with unconvincing happy endings. And in Klara and the Sun, I thought, yes, there's a lot of sadness in the world, but it is still possible that when somebody believes in something good in the world, that they're not absolutely crazy. And that you can hold on to some kind of faith in something good in the world, and you will not necessarily be let down. So for me, it was very important that Klara's faith in something good being in the world, her faith that the sun is something that is beautiful and will help her and will help all human beings. I didn't want that belief to be shattered. Whereas in Never Let Me Go, I think, as you alluded, this hope, this wish that the main characters have is shattered towards the end. Yeah. So in a way, no, I don't have this scheme of actually kind of bringing back unhappy characters and resolving it. But in a way, I think what you said there is true, because I think I'm trying to, I suppose, reply to what I feel was a perhaps unnecessarily and perhaps overly pessimistic view of the human condition that I had in earlier books.
Grazie. Noi abbiamo deciso anche di lasciare un po' di spazio alle domande del pubblico che io ricevo sul telefono, e quindi Ish, se sei d'accordo, io ti rivolgerei alcune domande che ci sono giunte. La prima di queste domande è:
Sure.
Quanto è importante la filosofia, soprattutto quella classica, per la tua narrativa? E se vuoi
Well, actually, I did study philosophy to some extent for my first degree at university, but a lot of the texts were so difficult I couldn't understand them. I couldn't understand Kant, and I couldn't understand Descartes, and so I found a way of always choosing ancient Greek texts in different courses, and so I only read Plato. I don't know. I mean, it wasn't my major; it was my minor subject. But I have a degree in literature and philosophy for my first degree, and I have this degree, but I've only ever read Plato. But I think Plato had a huge influence on me, and I think many of certainly my earlier novels, that basically ask the question: so what is a good life? And usually people think this is a good life, but then they discover that it isn't. It falls apart on them. That is a typical structure of a Platonic, of a Socratic dialogue, as Plato writes it. So I think that has been I think Plato's works, not so much the Republic, but a lot of the other dialogues have had a huge influence on the way I structure my novels and how I choose the subject matter for my novels. And I must also say that at this particular point in time, I think there is a very important lesson from Plato's texts. Over and over again, the character Socrates says that because it is very difficult to find the truth, we must not abandon the search. We must not start believing that anything can be the truth. Just because something is difficult to find, it doesn't mean that it isn't there to find. Now, I think this is a very important message for today's age. We seem to be losing, in some parts of the world, and perhaps in all of our lives at the moment, we are losing some sort of faith that there is a truth to be discovered, and that we are saying that, well, we can all have our own private truth as long as we feel it enough. It can be the truth. You have a man who used to be the American president until recently, who chooses to believe that he won the last election, and it seems that half of America thinks that's true. I mean, we seem to have this idea that truth is whatever you want it to be, and I think there is always this temptation that the search for truth is very difficult. And so let's abandon it. Let's just make up the truth. And so I think this is a very important message for all of us at this point in time. Okay, so that's me. And but I don't spend all my time reading classical Greek philosophy or anything like this.
Per quanto poi in Klara e il Sole ci siano alcuni dialoghi in cui Klara, nel suo modo così naif di porre delle domande per capire, è quasi maieutica come Socrate, poi tira fuori in effetti delle verità dai personaggi che dialogano con lei. Ma un'altra domanda è sempre legata a Klara e il Sole. Chiedono, c'è un passaggio in Klara e il Sole in cui un personaggio dice abbi fede, hai bisogno di fede. Poco più avanti lo stesso personaggio dice non hai bisogno di fede, hai bisogno di razionalità. Lei si colloca dalla parte della fede o della razionalità?
Well, I'm not quite sure which passages we're referring to here. I would always stand on the side of rationality, let's say. I think it's very important that we do try to think in a rational way. And I think particularly in the, once again, I think if we look at what's happened in the past year, we have seen we have seen two rival approaches come to a kind of climax. On the one hand, because of the pandemic, we have come to rely on science in a desperate way. All our questions we have addressed to scientists. What is this pandemic? How do we get out of it? Is this safe? And so it's been a triumph, in a way, of the scientific method of getting at truth. Of course, there's a lot of disagreement among scientists. They can disagree viciously, but they have a procedure where evidence has to be presented. And if the evidence is against you, you accept that you are wrong. So we have had that come to some sort of climax. But at the same time, when we're relying on scientists and depending on this scientific method, we, as I just referred to, we saw the US elections, and in general, we have seen many conspiracy theories developing all around the world about all kinds of things, including about the pandemic, where people seem to have lost faith in the truth. And there is this other approach to truth, that truth is, there's a different genre of truth, that you don't have to have evidence. It's not based on evidence. It's based on your emotions, how much you want it, how much you feel. In other words, it's outside of rationality. And I think this is a very dangerous way to go. And so, however brutal and cold sometimes rationality might seem, I don't think rationality has to be inhumane. I think actually, ultimately, rationality is humane, and it is compassionate. And I think I would actually. So I would say this is, at this particular moment in history, it's very important to stand on the side of rationality.
Beh sì, anche da un punto di vista... Oh, scusate. È vero quello che dici sull'epoca della post-verità, e per riprendere anche la questione appunto filosofica, sembra che il principio di non contraddizione non abbia alcun senso, per cui tutto può essere costantemente vero e falso quasi al tempo stesso. Ti porgo ancora una domanda che arriva dal pubblico. So che lei, ci sono prima una serie di complimenti che non ti riporto. So che lei scrive anche di musica. Quanto è importante la musica nei suoi romanzi?
Well, Armando, we were going to talk about music. We didn't actually deal with it very much. I mean, in answer to this question, I would say it's very important. You can probably see a piano and a guitar behind me right now. My apprenticeship as a writer was in writing songs. Until I was about 23, 24, my ambition was to be a songwriter. And I was a kind of singer-songwriter. And I made these demo tapes for record companies, and I was a total failure. But I very quickly, when I was 24, 25 years old, I switched from writing songs to writing short stories and then writing my first novel within the course of about 1 year. And that's how my writing career started. And it's only now, I think, I realize how much the way I write novels has been influenced by my background as a songwriter. I wasn't so aware of it at the time. But, so I'll just take a couple of examples, but there are many examples I could take. But I always like this first-person voice. Not just the first-person technique, but I like a particular kind of tone. If you like, it's a lonely tone. It's not like stadium rock. It's like one person with an acoustic guitar singing in a small room to maybe about 10 people, something very intimate and personal. It's that kind of voice that I always try and go for when I'm writing a novel. And the narrator always narrates in that kind of way to just a small group of people that the narrator is addressing. That's because of my song background. The other thing I think I've only become aware of recently is that I think I care much more than other writers, or many other writers, about what happens after the reader has finished reading my book. Many writers talk a lot about different techniques of how to write and how to keep the audience's attention, how to trick them, and so on. How to hold them with suspense. And I worry about those things as well. But I think I worry a lot about what happens afterwards, because it's very important for me that novels stay in people's minds, and not just stay in people's minds, but they just haunt people, that they linger in people's minds, not just for a few days after the book is finished, but maybe for years. And I think this is because my first ambition was to be a songwriter. And when you write a song, you're not trying to write something that would entertain people for the 3 minutes when the song is playing. Of course, we all know this. With a song, the idea is like a virus. You're trying to lodge this song in people's hearts and minds. You want them to remember this song forever. And when they reach a certain emotional point in their lives, they remember this song. And it seems very natural. It accompanies a particular moment, whether it's a happy moment or a sad moment. The song helps them. And this is your ambition as a songwriter. It's not about just entertaining people at the time. It's about lingering. It's about haunting people afterwards. And this is a very important aspect for me of how to write a novel. And I think sometimes I am prepared to sacrifice some things during the actual reading experience because I think it will improve the ability of a novel to stay in people's minds afterwards. And I think a lot about what is it that makes some books stay in the mind and other books, even the ones that you really enjoy when you're reading them, they kind of fade and go away quite rapidly. So that's something I think about a lot.
Beh, noi questa sera su questo stesso palco avremo un tributo a Leonard Cohen, che non so se sia anche tra i tuoi musicisti più amati, ma insomma sicuramente è uno che col desiderio e con la solitudine si è intrattenuto, se così si può dire. Io vorrei farti un'ultima domanda invece, che riguarda il desiderio. In parte ne hai anche già parlato, ma più legato ai tuoi romanzi. È vero che ci sono dei desideri impossibili, è anche vero però che spesso i tuoi personaggi contribuiscono a rendere questi desideri impossibili perché sembrano rinunciare a combattere, sembra rinunciare a battersi. Penso appunto ai cloni destinati poi a essere utilizzati con l'espianto d'organi. Poi uno leggendo il romanzo si chiede ma perché non fuggono da qualche parte. Lo stesso Stevens rinuncia a provare forse ancora, avrebbe dovuto farlo prima, ormai è tardi, però forse c'è ancora spazio, chi lo sa. Invece forse, ecco, Klara in questo senso è anche un po' uno spartiacque, perché invece Klara, proprio l'androide, Klara esercita in certi momenti del libro una specie di resistenza passiva. C'è un momento in cui una bambina la vorrebbe scegliere nel negozio, lei non vuole perché si è promessa a Josie e quindi fa davvero resistenza passiva, sembra il Bartleby di Melville, non risponde, non dice, quasi un preferirei di no. Volevo chiederti di questo, delle mancate ribellioni di alcuni tuoi personaggi, se tu credi che effettivamente siano delle mancate ribellioni o se per te sono qualcos'altro, e se pensi che dei no a volte non siano anche importanti, perché poi noi ci definiamo anche molto attraverso ciò che decidi, ciò a cui diciamo no, ciò che decidiamo di non avallare, ci definisce tanto quanto ciò a cui diciamo sì.
Absolutely. I think it's very important to say no. I think it takes strength to say no, but I think what progress we have made as a civilization, a lot of it has been made by the courage of people who said no. You know, and incidentally, I think we have made tremendous progress since, say, the middle of the 20th century. I have enormous respect for not just rebellion, but for independent thinking, the ability of people to think independently. Now, I think my books don't contain many rebels, but they often follow that moment when a character becomes slightly more conscious of where they fit into history or where they fit into the larger society. So this is what happens to Stevens. He makes, to us, just a small journey. He doesn't turn into a revolutionary, but he's made a profound journey. He has changed his whole idea about what gives dignity to a human being in the 20th century. And he has abandoned the values that he has had for most of his life. And that might not be counted as rebellion, but this is a very, very important change. And I feel the clones in Never Let Me Go also manage to create a certain amount of intellectual freedom for themselves. But the reason that they don't rebel in the kind of the Hollywood movie sense is because I suppose there's two reasons for that. I think my observation is that in real life, people don't rebel nearly as much as they do in movies and in books. The rebellion rate is far, far lower in real life. Most people, or many people, they remain in bad marriages, bad jobs. They continue to live in some bad part of the world. And they don't run away. They do their best. They do their best to try and make something of their lives where they happen to find themselves. Now, you might think of this as a failure, but there is something heroic about this as well. And so I have a lot of respect for people like that. And the clone, particularly, Kathy, the main clone in Never Let Me Go, is like that. I mean, she accepts her position, but within it, she does her best to do her job well, to be loyal to her friends, to do the very best she can for the people she loves. And I think that is actually quite a typical situation. I mean, throughout history, we have seen people not rebelling. They have become soldiers and died in thousands when they've been commanded to. I mean, people have lived in terrible squalor. This is a large part of how people live. But I want to say that there is also something within that. Even if they don't rebel, there is something courageous. There is something dignified. At least courage and dignity is possible. And in any case, in the case of Never Let Me Go, it's a kind of metaphor for mortality. The whole story is like a big metaphor. Of course, in the story there's a system where some large state comes and takes away their organs gradually, and then they die. But of course, this is what happens to us anyway in life. It's just that it takes a few more years. But this is the nature of our. We are mortal, and if we're lucky enough to grow old, that something like that will happen to us. So we can't rebel against that in the sense that we can't run away from it, but we can rebel in other ways. And this is why I introduce this idea of love. We can at least, we might not be able to escape death, but we build these things that are very important, like friendship and love, so that in the end, perhaps even though we can't run away, it matters less. I think that's what I wanted the reader to feel at the end of Never Let Me Go. That Kathy has lost everything in a way, but the thing that was most important to her, no one can take it away from her, which is that the boy that she always loved actually loves her. That she has that knowledge, and that can't be taken from her. I'm much more interested in exploring that than writing a story about people who blow things up and rebel. And there's a big explosion and the evil island sinks into the sea.
Grazie. Grazie mille. E effettivamente era questa anche la ragione per cui volevamo inaugurare con te e non con qualcuno che scrivesse solo di esplosioni. Era più coerente con Torino Spiritualità. Grazie mille Ish, grazie veramente per la tua generosità.
Thank you.
Per tutto questo tempo che ci hai dedicato. Voglio ringraziare ancora anche Simona Caldera, la nostra bravissima interprete, alla quale io col mio auricolare devo tutto. E niente, io spero di poter in futuro, con l'aiuto di Einaudi, averti anche ospite fisicamente qua, magari in un momento più facile. E qui insomma a Torino noi ti attendiamo a braccia aperte. Grazie mille, grazie.
Thank you very much, Armando. Thank you. Simone, thank you very much. Excellent translation. Perfect throughout. And wonderful audience. Thank you so much.
Grazie mille. Buona serata a tutti. Chi lo desidera trova delle copie firmate di Klara e il Sole nel nostro bookshop. Torino Spiritualità prosegue. Ci vediamo stasera e nei giorni a venire. Grazie.